So on Monday, we got back into Photoshop. We were looking at editing photos from the photographer's perspective, where we're not necessarily creating composites with multiple layers and adding text for marketing materials, right? We're just primarily looking at Photoshop as, hey, you know what? I have a photo here that I want to edit to make it look better than what the camera gave me after taking that photo. So even high-end cameras that do a phenomenal job at capturing an image still ends up being on the back end of post-production, where we do just a little bit of editing just to bring out the better qualities in that image. And obviously the higher quality of the camera, the more what they call dynamic range. There's more room on both the dark parts of the image as well as the brighter parts of the image. And of course, we talked about also Monday that if you can have access to what's called the RAW file, right? So whether you're shooting in JPEG or you're shooting in RAW, the RAW file is certainly going to give you more information in that file. They're usually larger file sizes. They're going to give you more information, so therefore you can push those colors or pull in, the exposure, where information would otherwise not be seen. You can bring that information. You can recover that data. So neither here nor there. So we're working with JPEGs, still able to do a lot here as we saw on Monday. But we'll go ahead and walk through that real quick, right? So we have our image here. It's a JPEG. We have our background. We wanted to make this image look better, so we jumped into our filter and our camera raw filter. We also talked about how Lightroom, this is basically a Lightroom light, if you will, in Photoshop, while Photoshop is rather robust, and you can do a lot with Photoshop, including some of those Lightroom type edits. Lightroom is a standalone piece of software that just, I wouldn't say it's relatively easy, but it's just been skinny down, but very pertinent or specific to editing photos. Nonetheless, camera raw filter brings up a new screen, very similar to Lightroom, and then we have our basic edits. We talked about our basic edits, curves, details, color mixes. We talked about all of these, but we'll just quickly jump through them, right? So basic edits, we can warm the image up by increasing the warmth, or maybe we want this to be a little bit cooler. Double clicking on the little slider there will bring us back to 0. With this particular image, we wanted to make it a little bit warmer. And again, we did this together, so I'm just reviewing this. We can change the tint if there's some type of color casting taking place, but in this instance, there's not. The exposure, and as we talked about the exposure, we looked at the histogram up here where everything is to the left are blacks along with our shadows, and everything to the right are going to be our bright areas such as our whites and or highlights, and then what's in the middle is our exposure. And it's just a visual representation of what the image is in some type of graphical manner. So we raised the exposure. We talked about contrast. Contrast is just increasing the strength and the difference in dark and light colors. Our highlights are those bright areas. So usually what photographers will use the term as being blown out. Blown out is where the information is just, there's too much information there. You can't see anything anymore. So if I raise my highlights, there's, the sky is what they call blown out. There's no information there. As I reduce that, you can see I can recover that information. My shadows, again, I can bring in light into those darker areas. My whites, again, are those brighter areas. And my blacks, again, are those darker areas. But again, I can increase the contrast through that as well. We then have texture, clarity, and dehazing, which is another form of contrast. It can either make it very contrasty, where all those little pixels become more defined, or I can make that image look really soft by bringing that texture down. Clarity, again, more contrast, less contrast. Dehazing, again, more contrast, less contrast. Then we have our vibrance, which are affecting color. So whether we're increasing the saturation in the vibrance or the saturation in itself. And of course, we have curves, whether we're dealing with all of the image or particular colors like the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. We can affect the dark and light areas there by using curves. We have details such as more contrast type edits where we can sharpen the image. We can reduce the noise, which is that granular effects that are in the image, as well as color noise. The noise can both live in black and white pixels, but also, more importantly, it can live also in colors, so you can reduce the noise there as well. And we have the color mixer, right? So now we can isolate specific colors, changing the hue, saturation, and luminance. I think in this instance, we increase the saturation in our oranges. We can also do some color grading with the highlights, shadows, and midtones. Highlights are going to be those bright areas. Shadows are those darker areas, and the midtones are everything that's in between. We can change the colors of those areas of the image, as well as the brightness and darkness of that image. And then, of course, we have optics. So if there's any type of distortion with camera lenses, or maybe you're doing some architectural type photography where the lines in the streets and buildings they become a little bit distorted because of the type of lens that you're using, or even the focal length will sometimes affect that as well. And then we can continue that with geometry, changing the aspect ratio and angles of the image. And then we lastly have effects, whether we're adding grain. So while most images these days are all digital, we can certainly add grain in there to give it that stock film effect, as well as vignetting, changing the darkness or lightness on the edges and corners. And we can go even deeper into our colors by calibrating through hues and tints, etc. Right? So that's what we did on Monday. When we clicked OK, we applied that filter to our layer. However, we saw that that's a destructive edit. That layer has been destroyed. There's no way to recover that unless we undo that process, right? Click Edit, Undo. So we then jumped into our next image, which was of the drone photography or drone photo with the beach and the pier and the people on the beach. And we went through those basic settings. However, before we did that, we duplicated that layer, allowing us to manipulate just the copy of that layer, which left us with the original. And of course, we can see what we did there with those settings. All right, so we're going to continue that today through the girl snapshot. So if you don't have that open, please have that open on your screen right now. That's the image that we're going to work with together. And, so like take this photo in as you see it. Like it looks like a very well taken photo. Okay, very close up, but we have nice blurry background, which they call bokeh. She seems to be very much in focus, very sharp, right? Colors look pretty good there, right? Pretty decent looking image. So let's see how we can elevate it just with some small little edits. And again, we're going to use that camera raw filter. But again, before we do that, let's make sure that we duplicate this layer so that way we can retain the original image. So whether you like right-clicking on it and selecting duplicate layer, or you prefer dragging it down to the little plus sign, really don't care how you do this, but let's make sure that we get that background copy. We want to make sure that we have a copy of the background layer. If you missed how I did that, again, right-click, select duplicate layer, or you can click and drag that down to the little plus sign, and we have our background copy. With our background copy selected, we're going to go ahead and click on Filter and Camera Raw Filter, just like we did yesterday with those first two images. Shortcut is Shift-Control-A. Shift-Option-A if you're on a Mac. All right, so there's our camera raw screen. Now the version that I have is 13.2. Some of you might have a earlier version, 12 point something. Some of you in class might have even 14 points, whatever, right, or a more advanced version. So at the end of this particular lesson, you'll see where the differences lie. But for the most part, we should all be on the same page here for this first part of the edit. So here we go. There's our histogram. We can see that this appears to be a very well exposed image, but it's might be a little underexposed in certain areas. We'll see that here in a second. I'm going to jump over to my basic edit. It doesn't look neither warm nor cool, so I'm going to apply a little adjustment on there. So I'm going to bring up the warmth in this temperature just a little bit, +5. Remember, the little eyeball lets me see the before and after. So just by warming that photo up a little bit, you can see it's already starting to make this image look a little more vibrant, right? Just a little bit of warmth there helps me to make this image look a little better. Tinting, I personally use this when there's color casting. So if there's a lot of greenery around that might be casting its color onto my subject matter, I can use that there. But I don't see any of that in this image, so we're going to leave tinting alone. Exposure, we are going to raise the exposure up just a little bit. You can see in the histogram, we really start to shift those colors from the darker spectrum a little bit more towards the middle and higher end. So we're starting to bring those colors a little more to life here just by increasing the exposure. I'm going to do that at about 0.50, 0.50. Maybe just a little bit more. If I can get away with, there we go. Let's go about 0.75. You don't have to be exactly as my settings, but it's subjective. You might think that looks horrible, and you might want to go a different direction. It's subjective, right? It's your style. Maybe you like a more darker, moodier image. That's okay. Contrast, again, pay attention to your contrast, right? Like, look at those sliders and what is it doing when you go to one end of the spectrum to the other, right? Obviously, as I go to the right in the positive way, I'm increasing the contrast in those pixels. Opposite way, I'm softening the image, making it less contrasty. I'm going to add just a little bit of contrast here, not much, maybe +5. Highlights, again, those are those bright areas, right? So I personally like to reduce highlights. It just makes the shiny things less shiny, especially on skin, right? A lot of times skin will reflect light and it becomes very shiny, or you see these shiny parts of the skin. She doesn't have it too much here. You can see a little bit on her forehead, a little bit on her cheeks and nose, right? But if we reduce those highlights down, you can see it really mutes those bright spots, especially in the background. And it can really help to bring in more detail. Shadows. So again, you can see if I raise the shadows, look at how much light I can bring back in to her hair, right? So maybe you like a much brighter, less shadowy type image. I will say from shadows allow you to add texture to your photos. It allows your photos to be less flat, right? Like, so watch here, if I raise my shadows all the way up, it's a very flat image, right? Everything is pretty much lit about the same, right? And that's because I've lifted those shadows. But if I bring my shadows down, I can add a little bit more depth to this image, and it just makes the image contrast off the background, right? The subject matter really contrasts off the background. I don't like using the word pop, but it is what it is, right? She really pops off the screen there when we leave the shadows down. But again, subjective. So I'm going to raise my shadows just a little bit, maybe +15, just to bring in a little bit more detail in her hair where it's dark. My whites, again, those are those brighter areas. I like to bring my whites down. So we'll bring that down to about -25. Our blacks, again, are going to be those shadows, right? So again, very dark, less dark. I am going to bring my blacks up just a little bit, because when we reduced our highlights, it did make it look a little darker. So by raising my blacks a little bit, I can bring a little bit more light and exposure back into the image. So right about +20, maybe, somewhere around there. Again, texture, right? Like, you can really see how if I increase the texture, how much emphasis it places on those pixels, and it really starts to define those areas, right? It can really make, especially on skin, like texture is not a good thing. Okay, so this is at 0, this is at plus 100. It really redefines all those wrinkles and nooks and crannies that the skin tends to have. So raising the texture is not really a good fan of mine here, or fan of me here. If I reduce that, you'll see it makes it a lot softer. Now again, on the opposite end of that spectrum, right, like while it makes the skin look a little more smooth, it doesn't really look very real. You'll probably see a lot of these filters on like Instagram or any other photo type apps that you guys are using. Those little filters that get thrown on there. You've seen it. Your friends use it. It makes their skin look really, really soft. And you can tell, like, that's not really their picture, if you know them at least. So we're going to stay away from that. Clarity, the same thing. I can make that image really soft. In fact, if I use texture, clarity, and dehazing, like I can make this image look really, really blurry and soft. And again, just doesn't look real. Less is more with your editing. So I'm going to maybe bring the clarity down just a little bit, -4. I'm going to go to about -3 on my texture, just to soften a little bit. Not saying that you can't. I'm going to soften the skin just a little bit, very little. My vibrance, I'm going to bring it up a little bit. Sure, why not? Let's kind of saturate these colors a little. We'll go to about +20 on my vibrance. And then with my saturation, I'm going to bring that up to about +10. Don't want to overdo it. Right, so there's, right, remember the image, what it looked like before? There it is before. There it is after, right? Such a difference. Such a big difference with just some minor editing. All right, we could continue this. We could go into curves. We could even go into color mixer if we wanted to. However, I want to re-stress and re-emphasize this. When your subject matter are people, regardless of age, young and old, regardless of color, the whitest of white and the darkest of dark, all skin tones, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your shading, all skin tones have yellows, oranges, and reds. Okay? And when you start to push those colors around, you will affect the skin tone of that subject matter. So be real careful. Like, oh, but I want to make those lips look red. Well, that's great. I can grab that red, and if I really saturate that, you'll see that I'll start to get a little of a pinkish undertone with her skin. It's kind of hard to see, but it's there, right? Like you are affecting. If I go the opposite direction, you can see it really mutes down the skin. Right? Her skin tone looks a little more yellowish, almost purple here. So be real careful when you're pushing colors around on skin tones, red, oranges, and yellows. All right, we've gone through all of these already. Let's jump into some other tools that I wanted to get into today, which is the spot healing tool. Now, we've used these, the next tools that we're going to talk about, we've used in the past. Right? So this is really nothing new. It's just in a different screen, and it appears a little bit differently. So right up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have our spot removal tool. Shortcut is B in the camera raw filter. Shortcut B for the spot removal tool. And you'll see when we click on that, we get our screen changes. We can change the size of this tool. We can change the feathering. So when you mess with the size and feathering, you will get two circles. Right? The middle circle is the brush itself, and then the feathering is how soft that effect takes place. So if you remember it when we talked about brushes, right? The softness, think of feathering as the softness of the brush, right? The less feathering, the harder that brush is. The more feathering that there is, the softer that brush is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that little nose ring there. So I'm going to hold down Z. I'm going to zoom in on her nose right here. Escape to get back to my brush tool, or B for that brush tool. And I can adjust the size by using my keypad, those brackets, or I can slide over here for my size. And I want to be able to fit that nose ring in there perfectly. There we go. And I'm just going to click one time. Click. You'll see I get two circles. The red and white is what you're going to end up resulting, and then the green and white is what you're sampling. So if I come up here and I sample part of her eye, you'll see that in the red and white, that's how it's going to blend those pixels in there. And I obviously don't want that. So I'm going to try to get a little closer to the nose area. So somewhere right in here. That looks pretty good. And I'll hit enter and enter again to accept that. And there, the nose ring is gone. Okay, and I can continue that editing, right? So if I'm just trying to clear up any blemishes or things that are not wanted, I can continue that in the screen. So again, back to my spot remove, and I can get rid of this little mole on her lip. Maybe she's, I don't know, she doesn't want the mole there. The mole's gone. Probably not the best edit there, but we'll roll with it. So again, on her forehead, we have there's some minor skin blemishes here, so we can get rid of that as well. All right, so we'll click on those little bumps. We'll hit enter, and then we'll just continue that process. And we can continue to do this over and over again just by clicking. And when we hit enter and enter, there, those skin blemishes are gone. Nothing new, but we're doing that edit inside of that camera raw filter. These same editing tools and techniques can be done in Lightroom. Lightroom looks very much like this, a little more robust than what we're seeing. This is a skinnier version of Lightroom, but nonetheless, very, very close to Lightroom itself. All right, the last tool that we're going to talk about is the adjustment brush, shortcut K. If you have any version above 13, your guys's, so it'll look like a little circle, a dotted circle, and I believe it's a masking brush. Is that correct? Where are my 14.1s? Is it masking brush? Yeah, so it'll be a little circle. It says masking brush. Same technique, right? However, in anything below 14, everything is on this particular layer. So I have an adjustment for that, but just know if you have 13 or above, you can create masks with the brush. Okay, so for the majority of you, here we go. Adjustment brush, shortcut K. So the adjustment brush allows us to paint in those basic edits, or any of those edits, right? So if we want to increase the saturation or change the colors, we can do so on the very exact areas that we brush, right? So for example, her lips. I'm going to zoom in on her lips. I'm going to come down here to my basic edits, and any adjustments that I do here will only take place on the brush. So if you're watching the image as well as the histogram here, as I increase the exposure, nothing's changed. The histogram stays the same, right? It's just, these are just the settings of the brush itself. So I don't need to make any changes there. I do, however, want to change my saturation, and I want to use the color red. Now, if I wanted to, I could paint her lips blue if I wanted to, or at least introduce blue, which is going to give me more of a purple color, right? But in this instance, I'm going to use red, brightest of reds. I'm going to crank my saturation down just a little bit, around 75-ish. And with a smaller brush, I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to paint on her lips. Now, this is not painting colors. It's taking the red that is in that area, and it's just cranking up the saturation level. Right? It's identifying red pigments, and it's just allowing me to over-embellish them. This is the same process that you would use with black and white images. Right? If you wanted to paint a black and white image, add color to a black and white image, this is the same process that you could use. So even if I come over here to her face, right, and I paint, right, it's notice the difference in the two, because there's more red pigments in her lips than there are on her cheek, but however, there are still red pigments in her cheek. So again, it's just isolating those red pigments and allowing me to ramp up the saturation or the settings that I have here on my brush. Right, so there we go. Nice bright red lips. Obviously, that's to the extreme. It doesn't look real. I would obviously, recommend that you do a little bit different type of edit there. Okay. Same with her eyes, right? So if I want to add an adjustment to her eyes, okay, I would obviously not want to use red. I could use red. Let's see what happens if we do use red. Right, so it kind of turns her eyes a little more orange, don't they? But if I wanted to, right, maybe I want to use more of a hazel color. So maybe I'll come in here and go a little bit more closer to greenish yellow. So again, I'm just going to paint over the area of her eyes. Okay, there we go. So that was before the basic edits with the adjustment brush. There's with the basic edit and the adjustment brush. If we click OK, it's going to apply those changes to our background copy. There's the after. There's the before. Drastic change. Drastic change. All right, it's a pretty good start there. Let's take this up another level. For those that have the 13 or 14 or above, you guys obviously can create masks. For the rest of you, let me show you how we can introduce masks just to add another level of simple, basic edits, right? So if we don't like using the adjustment brush, we can use layers. Layers allow us to edit very specific parts of the image. It's a little bit harder if you don't have the 14.1. Right, so if you have 13 or below, we have to use this process. All right, so we're going to make a duplicate copy of our background copy. So again, we're going to right-click, select duplicate layer, or click and drag to make a copy of background copy. So now we should have background copy 2. Background copy 2. So with background copy 2 selected, we're going to make a selection of just our subject. We just want to select her. Now we could certainly use any of our selection tools. We could use a combination of several tools. We could use the quick selection tool, magic wand, and continue to add to those selections. But Photoshop does an amazing job at auto-selecting things for us. So we're going to click on select. And then from there, we're going to click on subject. Select and subject. Again, this is on background copy 2. And by clicking on select and then clicking on subject, you will see Photoshop's going to do its voodoo magic. And just like that, it has selected just our subject matter. Now, it doesn't do a perfect job, but it does a pretty stinking good job, right? Like obviously some of her hair strands are not quite selected, but like my goodness, this is this is pretty good versus if we had to do this by hand. All right, so this is a very good start. We're going to make a mask from this selection. Right? Ultimately, what we want to do is we want a black and white background and then she's going to be in color. So in order to do that, we need to isolate the background. So we have her selected. There's a couple ways that we can do this. This is I kind of like going through this process. So we're going to go ahead and create a mask based on this selection. We could invert the selection and then make a mask, which is going to it's going to be the same result. So background 2 selected. We made our selection. We're going to go down to our layers panel where that little square and circle is. Add layer mask. We're going to add a layer mask. And then you'll see what is in white is revealed and what is in black is concealed. Sorry, the other way around. I always get those confused. What is black is revealed, what is white is concealed. Right? So why are we able to, like, we can only see her face. The other things we can't see. Did I say that wrong? I said it the other way around. Anyways, you get it. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to invert this. So with the layer mask selected, not the thumbnail of the image, with the thumbnail of the layer mask selected, I'm going to hold down Control and press I. Control I is going to invert that. So now, if I close out background copy and background, all I see is the background here. All right, so we've created a layer mask from our subject. We've inverted that. And now we're going to select the thumbnail of our background copy 2, not the layer mask, but the actual image itself for background copy 2. Make sure you have it selected. We're going to go right back to my filter, camera raw filter. And now all we're going to do here is we're just going to desaturate it. That's it. It's going to desaturate it. Completely make it black and white. And then we'll click OK. And now what you should have is an image where our subject is in color and our background is in black and white. If I invert, right, so if I invert that layer mask, if you're watching my screen, if I invert the layer mask by pressing Control I, you'll see that the opposite takes place, right? Now my subject is in black and white and my background is in color. So again, all I'm doing there is just inverting Control I. I'm inverting the mask.